to advise you that Dawn is home from hospital. She's back with Graham. Pray for them as they have to make adjustments as far as what's going to happen, but just be assured that they're in good spirits and that they send their love. Dawn will not be able to drive anymore because of what's happened, so they'll be housebound, and I'm sure that you'll be welcomed in the next few weeks to be able to just pop in and say hello to them. It doesn't have to be long because they get tired very quickly, but they have together again. She has her granddaughter with her and who's looking after her until Monday. So just continue to pray for the family. And also this Friday on the 22nd at 10:30 at the Darwin Funeral Services, we'll be having a service for Mina Clancy. So there's many who would know Mina from her days through Reddy Dixon, and so basically it won't be a long service, but it's time to celebrate her life and to recognise what she's done. So all those, if you're planning on Friday, it's at 10:30 at Darwin Funeral Services. This morning we continue our look at the book of Zechariah, and it's an interesting time. As you can see, Alexander the World Conqueror is what we're doing. And one of the things I like about the Bible is that basically I could teach world history from the Bible. It's so relevant. The history of the world through the book of Daniel and through other Old Testament prophets, it really enlightens us. But we find from chapters 9 through 14, Zechariah talks about the future. He talks about what it holds for the nation of Israel now the temple has been completed. It's thought that the first prophecy of Zechariah until now, there is a break of around 40 years. And the point is, it points to the future. There will be a purpose that's different from what we've seen in the first 8 chapters. And the purpose is to encourage God's people that God hasn't forgotten them, God hasn't abandoned them, that there is a bright future ahead for the nation of Israel, and they need to remain true for what lies ahead. The prophetic, chapters 9 through 11, it deals with the first coming of Jesus Christ, his rejection as king, and in chapters 13 to 14, it deals with the second coming of Jesus Christ. So we literally have a record here in Zechariah of the first coming and the second coming. And in these first 8 verses, it's dealing with how God uses a world conqueror to accomplish his purposes in punishing the different nations around Israel and actually saving. And the interesting thing is, it's a prelude to what is coming when Jesus Christ himself comes. If one pagan man who didn't know God can be used as his instrument to accomplish his purposes, it's saying to his people, just think of what it will be like when my son comes to reign and rule on the earth. Imagine what's going to take place when Jesus Christ comes and sets up his kingdom and reigns and rules. So that's where we're at. And these 8 verses take us into history. Have we got any history buffs here? Well, maybe you can tell me about Alexander the Great and I won't have to do anything. Just as well I didn't take that on board. He's a Roman, is he? No, he's a Greek. What's a few details? It doesn't matter. But we're going to look at the scriptures, all right? And the scriptures, as we do it, I've called this a campaign against Damascus. This message is the word of the Lord. The message is against the land of Hadrach and the city of Damascus. The tribes of Israel and all the people belong to the Lord. The message is also against the city of Hamath on the border. Now remember what I said, the purpose of Zechariah is to encourage the people to get on with the work, rebuild the city, complete the temple, and remember, one main thing, God is still their God. He is still on their side. He would take care of them. He would protect them from the nations around them who treated them with indifference and from time to time who threatened their very existence. Nothing seems to have changed over the years. It's still happening today. Now, you might say, Pastor, where did you get Alexander the Great's name from here? Because it's not in the text, is it? Maybe I'm blind. Is Alexander the Great's name there? Well, how do I know that that's Alexander? Well, bear with me. It doesn't name him, but what I want us to understand is God predicts all the details about the campaigns that Alexander took, and they were all against Israel's enemies. And the reason is, he's saying, if you like, when you see what I've said come true, then you will know that what I say in the future, you can be sure of, will take place as well. It also sends a message that God can use whoever he wants, whenever he wants, and he can choose that person, that event, to be his instrument to accomplish his purposes. In this case, Alexander the Great was the instrument that God chose to deal with the nations. Now, he wants us to think about this. If I can use someone like Alexander the Great, an ungodly man, to destroy the nations and save Israel, imagine what I'm going to do in the end times when my son Jesus Christ comes as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, Zechariah says very clearly this message is a burden. And to have a burden means it's weighty. It has a responsibility. And Zechariah is a prophet. And he is telling the message of the Lord. And it burdens him because of what he's seeing, the impending judgment of God. And he has to deliver them. Now, what happens when somebody comes to you and gives you a message you don't want to hear? It's all doom. It's all gloom. How do you take to that person? You don't want to hear it, do you? You don't want to hear a message of doom and gloom. You want to hear good things, things you can rejoice and be glad in. But what Zechariah is saying, look, I've got this responsibility to let this message be known to the people. There is judgment coming. You're not going to want to hear it. And I don't want to give it. But you know what? God's called me to do this, and I'm going to deliver this message. The message is directly associated with Israel's neighbour, starting with those cities near Damascus. Now, where is Damascus today? Does it still exist? Where does it exist? In Syria, modern-day Syria, that we know today. And then it goes across to the Lebanon mountains, to where the judgments would begin. Now, the fascinating thing as this was written is that Damascus was the seat of the Persian governor of that area. And this is where God has chosen to start his judgment. And the text makes it very clear they couldn't be able to resist. This judgment was going to take place just as the Lord had determined. Now, the military campaign began after Alexander defeated Persia at the Battle of Issus. King Darius escaped, and rather than overextending his supply lines by pursuing him into the Persian interior, Alexander brilliantly turned south to capture all these Persian cities that are named here along the coast. Now, does anyone know exactly where they are? Does anyone care? Are you bored by history? You shouldn't be. Well, here's a map. All that coloured area is what Alexander conquered. And you'll see in there the city of Damascus. You'll see up there Isis. You'll see also Sidon and Tyre and Gaza and Jerusalem, all in our text this morning. So that just gives you a map so that you can envision this with your own eyes. And he followed the precise line stated in our text. After sparing Jerusalem, he proceeded south to defeat Egypt, which you can see down there as well. So now, in my research, there are many scholars that say, hey, these places didn't exist. But what we do know, they were under the Persian Empire. And we have that from the ancient Syrian writings. And the focus of this judgment is upon Damascus. Now, you might say, why? Well, Damascus was one of Israel's worst enemies, and it's situated in Syria today. And they plagued Israel from 900 to 721 BC. And God says this is where this judgment's going to begin. And it starts with a wonderful battle. The Battle of... Anyone know about this? It's interesting, isn't it? In history. And you can look it up on Dr. Google if you want to. If you've got it there, you can read about it while I'm talking to you about it and see whether I've lied or whether it is as it is. But it was one of the great battles. It's recorded in history for us. And this is where it begins. Because we're introduced to a young whippersnapper, if you like, called Alexander the Great. This is where he steps on the world stage. And we have this famous battle in 333 BC. He defeated Darius, the king of the Persian Empire. And it was from this point on that he began to dismantle, step by step, brick by brick, the Persian Empire. This is where it started. Now, our text says that when the eyes of man are all on the tribes of Israel, shall be toward the Lord. That's an interesting thought, because what it is saying is, when this judgment comes, then all the eyes of the world will be watching and taking note of Alexander and his progress in conquering the world. All those neighbours around will be watching, and they will be trembling with fear, if you like, shaking in their boots, as well as the tribe of Israel will be looking on as the events unfold before them. Now remember, this is what God said would happen, and it happened very quickly. Alexander wasn't a person to just sit around and do nothing. He was a go-getter, and he was very impatient. He had places and people and things to conquer, and he was just determined to keep pushing, and he did. Now, I am sure, and there are many scholars who agree, that it is Alexander the Great, because we have records in history that record for us his massive campaigns, his battles. They have maps of the regions that he conquered in quick succession. And you know something else? He can't be mistaken for somebody else, because there's nobody else has done what he has done. So that's why we can be sure it's referring to Alexander the Great. And he was just God's instrument. It had nothing to do with, it will be nothing, though, to what Zechariah is going to tell us in the next chapters about what God's divine conqueror, his son Jesus Christ, will do to the nations when he comes to reign as king and set up. So we're just getting a foretaste through Alexander the Great of what God's going to do with his son Jesus Christ at the second coming. People watched, they were waiting, they were anticipating, they were in shock at the speed Well, when Jesus Christ comes, people are going to be shocked, and they're going to be watching, and they're going to be waiting. Now, the second part of our verse, we're told the campaign against Tyre and Sidon. And against Tyre and Sidon, with their skill, Tyre had built a strong wall for herself. She had piled up silver like dust and gold like the mud in the streets. But the Lord will take away all she has and destroy her power in the sea. That city will be destroyed by fire. So he's taken Damascus. He's defeated Darius. And now he switches to the Phoenician territory that is west of Damascus. It's what we know today as modern-day Lebanon, in the cities of Tyre and Sidon. And from our text, we're told some insights about these two cities. They were well ahead of other nations, if you like. They were very progressive, very commercially minded, and they were go-getters. And they believed themselves to be superior and invincible to others. They had built up a reputation that they were so fierce and respected, and they didn't think that any other nations could attack them. They could see no vulnerabilities. They believed they were far superior to any other nations. Now, this little picture says a little bit. Over here, on this side here, you've got Alexander arrives. And that's the old city of Tyre that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. He was able to destroy that. And so they moved over, and there's if you like, a stretch of water, and they have a fortified city of Tyre that's built on a rock. And they thought they're invincible. So here's Alexander, and he's got a problem. How do I get across to the other side? How do I defeat these people? Well, you know, the old city of Tyre was being destroyed by Babylon, and so they thought they were invincible. They took this island of rock and they built their city, and they decided, according to historians, that they built a wall 150 feet high for extra security. So you have this city that's built with 150 feet high walls that surrounded them. In addition to these defences, they had one of the best navies in the world to defend it. So if you're on a city with a rock, you've got high walls, you've got the best navy in the world, you're invincible. If you lived in that city, wouldn't you think the same? Who's going to touch us? Eh? We're impregnable. Nobody can get in, not even a rat. We're safe. Yeah, right. Then it goes on to tell us in our text, to demonstrate her great wealth and power, Zechariah uses two very descriptive similes. Heaped up like silver, like dust, and gold like mine. Dust and mire stand for plentiful gold and silver, and Tyre had plenty in abundance. So basically, what it's saying is they had heaps of money. It just rolled in the streets. Anything money could buy, it was there. And the city reflected it. They were good commercial operators, traders. And so this gives you the idea. They lacked for nothing. They had all the wisdom, all the knowledge, all the modern technology, if you like, and resources available, but there's something they didn't factor in. When God determines the judgment is coming your way, it is coming, and there's nothing that can stop it. Now, history shows us that Assyria's king Shalmaneser besieged that city for 5 years and failed. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian ruler of the world, tried in vain to take it for 13 years. 13 years. he never was able to overcome it. It stood solid. So, history has proven we're impregnable, we're invincible, nothing to worry about. For at least 150 years later, Alexander the Great did what nobody else could do. And history bears witness that this prophecy was fulfilled to the letter. And this map will show. Alexander decided to build a land bridge. Now, where was he going to get his resources to build this land bridge? Well, I feel sorry for one of those people if you were conquered because you were put to work. He went back to the old city of Tyre, and guess what was there? Well, don't laugh. They didn't have old tyres, but they had plenty of resources for building. And so he put them to work. And he built a land bridge right across. Imagine you're sitting on the walls watching all this stuff and thinking, oh, you idiots, you fools, you're going to fail too. But can you imagine what's going through their mind as it gets closer and closer and closer? You're just standing on the wall and it's happening. Wow. And it says that he built this land bridge and then he bombarded the city with siege engines as the port was blockaded. How long did he take to conquer this unconquerable city? Remembering, Nebuchadnezzar, it was 13 years. No. How long did it take Alexander? It shows the determination of this man. It took him 7 months. 7 months to achieve the impossible. Nobody else had done it. He achieved it in 7 months. And we're told 10,000 of its defenders were massacred because, get this, according to history, Alexander was angry that it took so long. Some people you can't please. 7 months, I think, is pretty good. But he was angered, so he slaughtered 10,000 of the inhabitants. And then, just to top it off, the 20,000 that were left, he sold them into slavery. If Alexander was having a bad day, you didn't want to be on the other side. That land bridge still stands today as a testimony to the execution of judgment upon this once proud, this once luxurious and idolatrous city. Alexander took all her wealth, threw her wall into the sea, and burned the city. He did this in 7 months. And if you want further information from Scripture about Tyre and Sidon, you can look at Ezekiel chapter 26 to 28, and it gives you much more detail about how Alexander took it. It gives you much more detail about the city and its inhabitants. God's message to his people is a simple one. He says, I'm going to come and judge the nations through Jesus Christ, my Son. And just to show you I mean business, look at what I've done by using a pagan man. Imagine what I will do using my Son. I knocked down and destroyed the most invincible city in the world, who had everything that money could buy. When my Son comes to this earth as the judge, no one will escape his judgment. There'll be no immunities. Everybody will be judged. You've seen what I did with Alexander. It will show you I mean business. I always do what I say I can do, and when I make promises to you, I will keep them. On that you can be sure. So he's told them about this new kingdom that he's going to set up with Jesus Christ being the king. And to make sure that they understood, he's illustrating. I also told you about how I would use Alexander the Great to verify this before you. We have the campaign then that moves in verses 5 to 6 against Gaza. The city of Ashkelon will see it and be afraid. The people of Gaza will shake with fear. The people of Ekron will lose hope. No king will be left in Gaza, and no one will live in Ashkelon anymore. Foreigners will live in Ashdod, and I will destroy the pride of the Philistines. So you can imagine, here's this massive war machine on a seek and destroy mission. He has no boundaries, and he moves at such a rapid pace that everything that's in front of him is removed. Neighbouring cities had witnessed firsthand exactly what he'd done in Syria. Then he moves south and comes to Lebanon and Tyre, and he takes out what that known world thought was absolutely invincible. He sets his sight on Gaza. And if I'm in Gaza as a citizen, I'm literally shaking in my boots as I hear he's coming towards me. Alexander did everything, swept everything away. He took their wealth with a paradise, and now here's this city, if you like, of Gaza, waiting in fear and trepidation for what's coming their way. Now, history provides us with the record of Alexander's conquest of Gaza. And when you look at our verse, the king shall perish from Gaza. This is exactly what took place when Alexander the Great arrived. Throughout his military campaigns, Alexander met or had little resistance. You know, why would you? You've got this massive army. What's the best thing you can do? Surrender. Give up before you die. And this is exactly what happened. They gave up rather than fight. So he was able to take things pretty quickly. But, you know, today I marvel. We think we're so clever with our modern technology today. If you want to know something, what do? Most of you got it in your hands most of the time. You refer to Dr. Google. Now, Dr. Google must be a genius, because there's nothing that Dr. Google cannot give you an opinion on. If you want to find something, just Google it. Comes up straight away. But you know, I want you to understand something very clearly. Before the internet, before Facebook, before Twitter, there was something called the Bush Telegraph. And it can't be beat today. You know what the Bush Telegraph is? It's when people talk and tell somebody, and that goes and tells somebody else and somebody else. You don't need the internet, you don't need Facebook. People do it all the time. And you'd be surprised if you told somebody something, how far it goes. It's the Bush Telegraph. And here in Alexander's day, the Bush Telegraph was working overtime. You know, if they had operators there, they'd be putting in for a pay rise or quitting because it was too hot. It was working. But the Bush Telegraph told people, hey, you're next. This is what you can expect. This conqueror is coming. When Alexander came to Gaza, they resisted him for 5 months. Now, Alexander wasn't a patient man, and 5 months, it irritated him no end. And when he finally did conquer them, he didn't give them the usual freedoms, like when he came to a city and they opened the doors and said, we surrender, come in. He allowed them to basically continue their way of life with very few restrictions. But when he met this resistance for 5 months, it ticked him off. 5 months, instead of opening the doors and let me do what I want to do, they resisted. How dare they? So when he conquered them, he took away their privileges. He wouldn't give them the freedoms that he gave to others. And he was so cranky. Now, I'm not making this up. You can read Dr. Google if you want to, but it's in the history books. So to make an example of how angry he was, He took their king, whose name was Baptiste, and you know what he did to him? Just as an example, because he was ticked off, he took some great spikes, he drilled holes through his feet, then he wrapped thongs through those holes and dragged him through the streets of the city as an example of this is what happens when you get me cranky. Wow, don't tick him off. You might end up the same way. Our text says that a foreigner shall dwell in Ashdod. None other than Alexander the Great. He was an outsider. He was a foreigner, yet he reigned and he ruled over Gaza. They would lose their country to him because of their pride, and they ceased to exist as a people. Now, Alexander allowed many of the people he had conquered and held as slaves to settle in Gaza. So his idea was he took this city of Gaza and he brought all these conquered people with him. And he said, you can live here. So what does that do to a culture and a place when you're conquered by a foreign group? Right? It destroys the culture. And this is exactly what happened. All the outsiders came in and they intermarried, and basically you don't have Philistines anymore. They don't exist. But he took their nationality. He took whatever they had built. He accumulated it and he destroyed it by adding other cultures in. And so, what was left of the Philistine pride and nationalism was taken away. And what we then have is the campaign against Jerusalem in verses 7 and 8. I will stop them from drinking blood and from eating forbidden food. Those left alive will belong to God. They will be leaders in Judah and Ekron and will become like the Jebusites. I'll protect my temple from armies who would come or go. No one will hurt my people again because now I am watching them. In verse 7, there's 3 promises that are made in this verse. In this judgment, God would deliver them from their idolatry. In other words, the people that were there in Gaza. I will take away the blood from his mouth and the abominations from between his teeth. In other words, those who survive this judgment would be converted to God and will become like a leader in Judah. And it's an amazing promise. Not only will they be saved in the covenant with God, but they'll be given an honourable status. Ekron was the closest city of Judah and may be representative of the Philistines converted to the Lord. The Jebusites were the inhabitants of Jerusalem when David conquered that city. When that happened, these people embraced God as their God. Now, this part of the prophecy, it looks further beyond Alexander's day, and it won't be completely fulfilled until the second coming of Jesus Christ. So here we've got Alexander having cleansed and conquered many lands. He now makes his way on the map towards Jerusalem. And the promise in verse 8 covers many years in their fulfillment that the Lord is determined to treat his people in a different way than the neighbours. If you saw Alexander and his war machine coming towards you, Jerusalem, you're expecting trouble, big time. But this is an end time fulfillment of this verse, and it wasn't completed in Alexander's day. The promise says, no more shall an oppressor pass through them. This was not fulfilled in Alexander's day. Why? History tells us that there was more oppression to the Jewish people and Jerusalem in particular under the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes IV in 168 BC. Then we know that Rome plundered Jerusalem in 70 AD. So it hasn't been completely fulfilled in the time of Alexander. History records the partial fulfillment of 2 specific prophecies with Alexander's forces at Jerusalem. And it's amazing because during the invasion of Alexander, Jerusalem will be spared. And we know from history that Alexander did spare Jerusalem, and he treated the Jews with great favour. And I find it interesting in doing my research for this, the amount of modern day scholars that just scoff that Alexander ever went to Jerusalem. They said, no, he didn't have time. You know, he went to Egypt to conquer Egypt. He only had 6 days. He couldn't do it. He didn't have the time. You know how far it was from Jerusalem to that next campaign? 50 miles. That's all. Can you do that in a day or two? Yes, you can. And I can't understand, I really can't understand why they dismiss that Alexander went to Jerusalem, because there's a Jewish historian named Josephus, and it's in book 13, and he gives us this account. And it's interesting that they have pictures and everything else to show what happened. When Alexander began his campaign against Phoenicia, he sent messengers, and this I'm quoting from Josephus, to the high priest in Jerusalem, demanding aid from the Jews and the payment of tribute, which they used to pay the king of Persia. Not wanting to break his oath to Darius the high priest, he refused. So after he defeated Gaza, Alexander proceeded towards Jerusalem to subjugate them as he had done with the other nations in his campaign. When the high priest knew Alexander was coming, he was alarmed, and he called the people to prayer for God's protection. In answer to their prayers, God instructed the high priest in a dream to adorn the city and open the gates. He and the priests were to meet Alexander in their priestly garments, and the rest of the people were all to wear white. They were to do this without the dread of any ill consequences. This was to be an act of obedient faith. This is recorded by the Jewish historian. And when he, the high priest, understood that Alexander was not far from that city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of citizens. The procession was done, and the manner of it different from that of other nations. It reached to a place called Saphra, which name translated in Greek signifies a prospect. For you have thence a prospect both of Jerusalem and of the temple. And when the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans that followed him, Alexander, thought they should have liberty to plunder the city, the torment the high priest to death with the king's displeasure fairly promised them. The very reverse is what happened for Alexander. When he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the golden plate whereon the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and adored that name, and first saluted the high priest. The Jews also did all together with one voice salute Alexander and encompass him about. Whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, and supposed him disordered in his mind. However, Parmenio alone went up with him, and asked him how it came to pass that when all the others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. To whom he replied, I did not adorn him, but that God who hath honoured him with his high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea thither. For that he would conduct my army, he would give me the dominion over the Persians, whence it is, and having seen no other in the habit, now seeing this person in it, and remembering that vision and the exhortation which I had in my dream, I believe that I bring this army under the divine conduct, and shall therefore therewith conquer Darius and destroy the power of the Persians, and all things will succeed according to what is in my mind. What is it actually saying? Do you get all that? Or are you bored? It tells us something about Alexander. He had a dream, and God gave him this dream. He understood and knew that this Jewish God was the one that was giving him the power and the drive for his army to succeed. And he's acknowledging it in a dream of all things. An ungodly ruler understood that God, the God of the Bible, was giving him this. That's amazing. Now I can understand now why secular historians don't want to acknowledge that he stopped at Jerusalem. To acknowledge there's a supernatural God that's in control of men's affairs? Hey, that's can't have that. That's just not, can't have that at all. We've got to come up with a different scenario. The story goes on with Alexander going into Jerusalem and sacrificing to God according to the priest's instruction. Josephus writes, and when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended, and he was then glad. He dismissed the multitude for the present, but the next day he called them and bid them ask what favours they pleased of him. The high priest asked that they might operate under the laws of their forefathers, pay no tribute on the 7th year. All of this Alexander granted. History is amazing, but you don't think to get it from the Bible. You really don't. How did Alexander's conquest fit into God's overall plan of redemption? Well, if we think about it, the conquest of the Persians paved the way for the first coming of Jesus Christ to spread the gospel after Jesus' resurrection. The Greeks taught their culture and their language to everybody that they conquered. You know, Greek became the universal trade language of all peoples that were conquered. And when Rome became the dominant power, the Greek language was the second language of the empire. So the Jews translated the Old Testament into Greek, making the revelation acceptable to so many people at the time of Christ. It enabled them to spread the gospel to all corners of the known world. What is God promising? He's promising to his people, I haven't finished with you. I haven't abandoned you. I have a purpose. I have a plan for you. I will put you in the original place that I intended you to be representatives of one people, one nation, under God, living for him. And I will keep my promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can trust me. I have just shown you what I can do by using an ungodly world conqueror to accomplish my purposes in destroying the nations that caused you problems, and then using that same conqueror to preserve my people. This is just a taste of what is to come when my son Jesus Christ comes to set up his kingdom. So it's giving us a preview of what is to come. And that should encourage us today. Can I trust the Word of God? Yes. As I said, I could teach history from the Bible, and it'd probably be better than what I read in most secular history books. But the Bible is relevant. God never does anything without a purpose, and he's encouraging his people, hey, I'm in control. Things are happening according to my will and my purposes. You can trust me. I will deliver. So this morning, trust God. The circumstances could look pretty bad and pretty grim, but God is in control. He can use any